start recording. Things that people did to maintain their dignity, things that people did to care for others, things that people did to make it so that the Nazis would not destroy people's humanity, even under the most brutal and terrible circumstances. And I have a couple of different examples of this that I'd like to share with you. Some of them are from the Yad Vashem archives, which is really an amazing, the Yad Vashem online presence is really incredible. And the amount of research that someone can do is really amazing. And if anyone has time, it's really worthwhile spending time poking around the Yad Vashem website to read and to watch videos and look at documents. And a lot of what I have today is from that. So the notion of spiritual resistance is related to this word Überleben, which means to outlive. That each individual would do everything possible to foil the Nazi attempt to destroy the Jewish people as a community and individual. So this didn't only mean doing everything that one could in order to live. This also meant doing everything one could in order to document what took place in the camps and in the ghettos. I think it was this past, it could have been recently, I think it was the JCC showed a documentary about the Oneg Shabbos group, which was a group in the Warsaw Ghetto that was committed to writing down everything that took place. And then eventually those documents were hidden in the ghetto floor, and many of them, but not all of them, were found after the Shoah. The resistance that I want to focus on today is different than that. That's been well documented. But I want to talk about resistance with the camera. There are a couple of famous photographers who risked their lives during the course of the Shoah in order to document what was going on. One of them, one of the most well-known, is Mendel Grossman. And you see his picture here on the slide. He was in the Lodz ghetto. And it's important to note that it was illegal for Jews to own cameras and take pictures in the ghetto. But some Jews, because they held official positions in the ghetto, they were allowed to have cameras, but it was still illegal to take the type of pictures that Grossman was taking. But nonetheless, at risk to his own life, he took these pictures. What I want to do, I don't have a lot of the pictures to show because a lot of them are very, very heavy pictures. You can see them on the Yad Vashem website. If you go to their photo gallery and just type in Mendel Grossman, you'll see all the pictures of his that survive. But what I want to do is I want to show the progression, how he himself attempted to show the progression of the deteriorating conditions in the ghetto through pictures of his own family, most of whom perished during the Shoah. So, as I noted, Jews were forbidden to own cameras in the ghetto throughout Eastern Europe. However, some Jewish photographers were hired by the Judenrat in Lodz ghetto to photograph official documents and to document official ghetto archives. Mendel Grossman was one of those people. He was in the ghetto in 1940, and he was working for the Judenrat, or the Department of Statistics in the ghetto, and he was hired or forced to take official pictures of things going on in the ghetto for the Nazis, so that they could attract clients to buy things that were being made in the ghetto. So he had a camera, and so once he had a camera, he decided he was going to use it to resist. Meaning he was going to make sure that there were pictures to document exactly what happened. The person who was in charge of the Judenrat, Chaim Rumkowski, forbade Grossman from taking any pictures in the ghetto, I guess, other than the ones that he had to take for his official capacity. And here we have a letter, text of a letter on December 8th, 1941. He wrote to Grossman, "I inform you herewith You are not allowed to work in your profession for private purposes. Your photographic work is confined only to the activity in the department in which you are employed. You are therefore strictly prohibited to do any photographic work. So not only were the Nazis prohibiting this, but even some Jews did not want. Now, it could be that the Jews did not want this to be done because it would perhaps backfire and they would be punished. But nonetheless, Grossman was up against a double burden in the sense that he was up against the Nazis who did not want him to take any pictures. And he was also up against some of his fellow Jews who also didn't want him to take any pictures. So what Grossman did, you see on the bottom, he slashed open the pockets of his coat and kept his camera hidden inside them. His camera stayed underneath the coat, suspended by a strap around his neck. From his pockets, Grossman was able to manipulate the camera, aim, open his coat slightly, and snap at the photographs. In this fashion, he accumulated thousands of pictures that tell us what life was like in the Lodz ghetto. This picture you have on the right is a picture of Grossman's father, looking relatively healthy. I'm not sure if this was taken before the war or at the beginning of the war, but this is a picture of Grossman's father on the right. He looks like he's reading a book or learning Torah or davening. That's Grossman's father. As the war continues, you see Grossman, he documents photographically his father's demise. And the Yad Vashem archives tell us that Grossman's most successful photographic record was one he made of his family. During the 4 years of the ghetto's existence, he lived with his parents, 2 sisters, a brother-in-law, and a nephew. And he was living with them every day, and he saw that they were deteriorating, and he took pictures of it. So just to go back, you see the picture of his father here, where he's an old man, but he looks healthy, as opposed to the pictures here, where he's gaunt under some cover in the very cold Polish winter, and then taking a little bit of food that they can and that they were given. And so you see here how Grossman, just these pictures alone are sort of a testimony to us as to what was going on in the ghetto at that time. And one of the more dramatic series of pictures that Grossman took was the picture of his nephew, Yaakov Freitag. And we see here 3 pictures. On the top, he's eating a cherry. And he looks relatively healthy. He looks like he's enjoying it, playing a little game with it. On the bottom, he is on you see then the deteriorating conditions. He's now on a food line with his mother. That's Grossman's sister, with the kerchief over her head. He still looks relatively healthy, and he looks like he's smiling. And then on the top right, you see Grossman eating what has been described as a frozen carrot, which was the type of typical food found in the Lodz ghetto. Frozen not because it was frozen to be preserved, frozen because it was garbage on the street, and frozen in the Polish weather. And you see his eyes are sunken. He just looks totally defeated. And again, this is an example, as difficult as these pictures are to see, they are example of what Grossman did in order to document what was going on. And by looking at these progressions, we're able to see very clearly how conditions deteriorated in the Shoah. And you should know that his sister and his nephew perished in the Shoah. Whatever happened to the photos? He hid over 10,000 negatives in round tin cans. That's a picture of him again on the left. He gave many of the pictures away to whoever wanted them, which is interesting. Thank God, because we'll see what happens. He emphasized again and again in conversation with friends he expected the negatives to reach Israel, to be exhibited. They eventually did. Well, when the ghetto was being liquidated, he hid them in tin cans. He had given some of the way, but he hid other ones in tin cans. After the war, his sister found them I'm sorry, so she did survive, excuse me. His sister found them. Um, he, in fact, he had died at 32. And then the 10,000 negatives were then sent to Israel, to Kibbutz Nitzanim. And this is just one of these terrible ironies of history, that these pictures survived the Shoah, and then the kibbutz fell into Egyptian hands during the War of Independence, and they were destroyed. And so out of the 10,000 negatives that 10,000 pictures that he took, only the ones that he had given out to other people, and some hidden by other people, survived. But the majority of the pictures that he took, the majority of the testimony that at one point existed of the pictures that he took, no longer exists because of that very, very terrible story of them being destroyed in the War of Independence. So Yad Vashem provides some, by the way, there's another picture of his sister on the right on another one of the food lines in the ghetto. And you see here just some questions which are posed on the Yad Vashem website. You know, why was it so important for photographers to capture life in the ghetto? The first photograph on the right depicts people lining up for food in the Lodz ghetto. The lady in the photograph is Mendel Grossman's sister, Roska Grossman. What do you think Grossman was trying to document, and why? And so these are just questions to think about as you consider the idea of this type of spiritual resistance, which was done through photography. Most of the images in the Holocaust museums around the world are from German sources. That's also important to know. So the few pictures that exist that were taken by Jews are very, very precious, and they provide perhaps a truthful or more accurate, or certainly a more personal type of Shoah remembrance than the pictures that the Nazis took. So that's one type of spiritual resistance. Grossman wasn't the only photographer. There were other photographers. Like I said, he's one of the most well-known. And this is a type of spiritual resistance that, because of Grossman risking his life, we have these depictions of what life was like in the Lodz ghetto as the war progressed. There's another type of resistance which I want to focus on, which are resistance from letters. This is sort of different. This is similar in the sense that these letters are written many times hastily by people who really don't know what's going to happen to them in the next few days. And they are sending letters to people: remember me, don't forget what happened to us, tell the world what happened to us. And you see here a picture on the right of a woman who is about to board a train for a transport. And she's, quickly, looks like she's bending over, and she found some sort of surface to write on. And a lot of these letters were given to people who stayed behind, or given to Christians in the hope that they would deliver them to their family members, or they were thrown out of the windows of trains in the hope that someone one day would find them. These desperate attempts that people had in order to try to get word about their situation to their families. And I have an example of a letter, but before we get to that letter, we have this little snippet of a letter from Zalman Gradowski, who was a Sonderkommando in Auschwitz-Birkenau. They operated the gas chambers, and he also participated in blowing up one of the crematoria. And he buried some papers, and he wrote on them. You see here: "Dear finder, search every part of the ground. Buried in there are dozens of documents of others and mine, which shed light on everything that happened here. As for us, we have lost any hope of ever reaching the day of liberation. The future will judge us on the basis of this evidence. May the world understand some small part of the tragic world in which we live." So that's a beautiful example of the purpose of people writing letters. They couldn't take pictures, but they, through letters, told people, or tried to tell people, what happened, not knowing what their future would bring. One such letter is a letter from the Kishinev ghetto, the actual letter is on the right. That actually the actual letter I think today is in Yad Vashem. And I have the translation of the letter in the next few pages. It was written by Ida Goldis. And these are the last letter that she sent to her sister Clara, right before she was about to be deported to a concentration camp. She was living at that point with her son Vili and her younger daughter Dubba, and her husband was already in the Romanian army. And they had to make a very difficult and long trip by foot, and the two women took turns carrying Vili on their back. But he, on this trip, froze to death, and his mother also died. Ida was 24 when she died, but Dubba managed to survive. And so Ida smuggled the letter out of the ghetto via a non-Jewish messenger, and this non-Jewish messenger got the letter to Clara, who was in Romania. Clara and Dubba survived. Dubba was with her at this point. Clara was not with her, and they went to Israel. And then finally, the letter was donated to Yad Vashem. And here. This is Vili, a picture of Vili on the little boy who perished in the trip on the march, and we have here the text of the letter. It's lengthy. We don't have to read the whole thing, but you could read in it some of her sense of nervousness and trepidation as to what is going to happen. Yesterday, I sent you a postcard, which, if you receive it, will cause you a great deal of sorrow. I am writing to you now, thanks to the goodwill of this gentleman, and I beg you not to tell mother the truth, since it is too awful, and I do not want this matter to impair her health, which is poor anyway. My dear sister, for a few days, a terrible danger has been hanging over our heads. We are to be sent on foot to Ukraine for resettlement, quote unquote, there, so they tell us. You can imagine our situation. We must go such a long way on foot. And she talks about her son. They're only allowed to take a little bit of food. Then there was an extension about this march, and she's feeling a little bit happier that maybe it will be extended. And she also doesn't want anyone to reveal the name of the person who got the letter out of the ghetto for fear that something bad will happen to him. She says, my dear, down here, my dear, please look after mother, since you will be the only remaining member of her family. So what we see here is her recognition that she's not going to live. And she wants to make sure that her sister knows that. Please look after mother, since you will be the only remaining member of her family. Never do what we have done, never part from her. And then she expresses some guilt, actually, that she left her mother. Towards the end of the letter, she says, now I have no hopes left. God did not want us to meet again. I suppose that I have sinned too much. Goodbye, my dear. Goodbye, my darling sister. Good luck to you. Bring up your dear children in happiness and good health. Thousands of kisses on your sweet eyes. And so, she knows that her time is very, very limited, but yet she writes to her sister in the hope that she not be forgotten, and that someone have a memory of her. And it's because of this letter that we know that this person existed. Without this letter, we certainly wouldn't know as much as we know now about this letter. So letters were another type of resistance, of a way to, again, say, I was here, I lived, and this is what happened to me. This is what these people did to me. I want to conclude with two more brief examples. I'm going to stop for a moment and unmute everybody, just in case anyone has any questions or anything to say along these lines. And maybe also what we'll do now is we'll pause for a few minutes, and we'll see if anyone has any pictures they want to share, or anything they want to, any part of the picture share. we'll take a break from the presentation. We'll go back to one other fascinating aspect of spiritual resistance. So let me. Does anyone? First of all, take if anyone going to put their hand up using the raise hand function on the Zoom, then I'll call on you first to ask a question, make a comment, or share a picture. And if not, I'll just go person to person. Okay, so Barbara Gilman, I am unmuting you. Okay, go ahead.
I have a picture here. It's not from the war, but this is from 1983. If you can see, it says Survivors Village.
Pick it up a little bit more to the camera.
Okay, can you see it?
Raise it up a little bit more. A little bit down. Now pull it forward, pull it back a little bit. It's a little hard. Okay,
well,
go ahead.
The thing is these are my parents in 1983. There was a reunion of survivors in Washington, D.C. President Reagan was there. If you see that thing says Survivors Village. My parents said when they got there, that was the first time in years that everybody who was there knew exactly what had happened and they didn't have to explain anything. It almost was a relief for them to be with all these people. And that's it. It says that's, and you went into the survivors' villages to what town you were from.
Oh, wow.
And that's how you met. My mother looked for her family. My father looked for her family. Unfortunately, they did not find anybody. But they had set up computers. In 1983, people weren't using computers so much, but they had set up computers. And unfortunately, these people were elderly, and they tried to find people. They didn't. At least my parents didn't. So that's the picture.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Judy.
Yeah. I have a picture of 15 people that were my grandmother's family in Berlin around 1930. They all perished. This is some kind of a family party. The two people, the lady and the man at the bottom, the man was her brother, and I'm named for him.
And so these are, what side of your family is this?
My father's mother's family.
Your father's mother, and these are, and every single person in that picture perished.
Yes, that's her brother, and that's her.
Where were they when this picture was taken?
Berlin. They moved from Poznanz or something, Poland, to Berlin. So they all moved to Berlin, and we have where they lived and when they went to the ghetto, or not the ghetto, when they went directly to the gas chambers.
And who are you named after in that picture?
Julius. I prefer the name Julia, but my mother chose Judith.
And again, who was he in your relation to you?
He was my grandmother's youngest brother. We don't know if there were any other, and we don't know who's related. We just know two men because they were these two. My son did all this research online. Two of them were these two who were fighting for the Kaiser in 1901.
Wow.
Maybe whenever that war was. The World War I.
World War I, yeah.
And my uncle, my father's brother, who knew nothing about cousins. None of the family knew anything about these people and who they were. They were fighting on the opposite side. So my uncle could have shot them.
He was a doughboy in World War I.
He knew nothing about these people, nor did my mother. The only story she knew was that her mother-in-law, the sister of Julius, asked if she would name her child after him because he had no children.
Wow.
Which was not true, but nobody knew anything. I don't know
That's
what
amazing.
they knew about the Holocaust. My father knew all about it. he took me to meet somebody who had numbers on her arm, a friend of his. But
Thank you for sharing. That's really incredible. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Shelby, did you
tell
want
one
to
more
share?
Can I tell one
Hold
more
on.
story?
Oh, yeah, okay. Go ahead.
I forgot to take the picture, but I have an aunt. My mother was one of 7. My father was one of 5. Each one survived with one sibling. My mother's sister was one of the few people who was ever in a gas chamber and lived to tell about it. She said they marched him, and you remember Tante Barry?
Yeah.
Eddie's mother. They marched him into the gas chamber, my aunt and her daughter, and it malfunctioned. And German efficiency moved that group out and brought in the next group. By the time it was their turn to go in again, they were liberated. The Russians came. They were in Auschwitz. My aunt survived Auschwitz in a gas chamber.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
the only
Thank
story
you.
I have.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Shelby, did you want to share a picture?
Yeah, this is another survivor of Auschwitz. My cousin Gail Klein, Bidget Danziger's daughter,
Yeah.
wrote this book, and I was going to read it to my grandchildren today. It's about her mother's time. The children's book written by her mother, Renee Danziger. And I was
Sure.
going to
I
read
didn't
it
know
to
she
my
wrote a book.
grandchildren in
Wow.
Israel today. It's a children's book, and I was going to read it to my grandchildren. I said, wait a minute, I'm going to call Gail and have the author read it to them. So she read it to them today. It's about her mother and her time and how she survived, and what music and butterflies helped her survive. But this is her mother, a beautiful woman, and she read the book to my
This is Renee's mother?
No, this is Renee.
Renee.
She was in Auschwitz also.
Wow.
And 2 of her sisters and her brother and her parents.
What's the book called?
Music of the Butterflies. I don't know if a few years ago, Renee and Gail were both involved with the Holocaust Museum. And a few years ago, they did a thing for butterflies where they got people to send 1 million butterflies of all different kinds of shapes and sizes. And they got 1.5 million. And then Gail found this picture of her aunt wearing a few years later, a picture of her aunt wearing a butterfly outfit. The aunt was killed. This is a picture of that picture. And it was an amazing story.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful story about the Holocaust and the survival because of music, and that took their mind off of everything when they couldn't do anything else.
We have an example of that coming up in the presentation in a few minutes, so thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much. Daniela Hampel, I just unmuted you. Was your grandfather a Holocaust survivor, Mr. Wishnia?
Hold on, I'll put the video on. Go, Ori, how do you put the video on?
Hold on.
My grandfather was, both my grandfather and my grandmother, and in fact,
So,
his dad.
just for those who remember, Daniela's grandfather, whose your site was this week, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, the last.
Died on the 7th day of Pesach. How many?
Right. Came to visit a few
9
times.
years ago.
And would bleed davening at the shul. He was a chazan. Do you want to tell us about him?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he grew up in Poland, and so there was a river, and so the river was really the border between the German-held part of Poland and the Russian-held part of Poland. So he went across. There was no food. There was no work. So he and a bunch of his friends went across the river, and they bribed people to get across the river to see if there was work on the other side of the river. And when they got there, of course, there was no work and no food. So many of his friends came back, but he went back, and then they, of course, all perished. And then, but he was going to go back, but then he got caught by the Russians. And so the Russians decided that he might be a German spy. So they sent him to Siberia.
Thank God.
And then, so there's all kinds of stories how he survived there, and so some people, they had these mushrooms and you had to cook them a certain amount of time or else they were poisonous, and a lot of people weren't patient enough to cook them and died from that soup. And then somehow one time he jumped off a train, and then somehow after I think he was there a couple of years, and then he ended up brought back to Uzbekistan by a train, and that's where he met Daniela's grandmother, and that's where Daniela's mother was born. And he basically kind of survived through the war by bartering on the train. He'd go on the trains and trade like sugar for, bring it back down, and then trade
Whatever
it for
they
flour
needed.
or whatever. So he went back and forth and bartered, and then after the war they went to DP camps, and then eventually ended up in Israel in Yaffo.
But it's interesting because when my grandfather realized, this is when he realized that he needed to leave Poland. He said, because he tried to beg his family to leave with him, but his family didn't. They're like, no, we have, your sister has a young baby, whatever the reasons were. But he knew that he needed to leave Poland. He says when he started to see in the streets the soldiers yanking the beards out of the Jewish men, he goes, that's it, now we need to leave. It's done. This is not, this is serious.
I have really sweet memories of him. And he used to
Yeah, he loved the diamond
thank
in
you.
the shul.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Okay, I want to show you. I'll go back now to the presentation. I came across this today. Can everyone hear me? Could you give me a thumbs up if you could hear me? Yeah. Okay. I came across this today. I was reading a few years ago in Israel. I was doing the thing I like to do best. I was going to some bookstores, and I found this volume of Yad Vashem Studies, volume 7, which was published by Yad Vashem in 1968. And there are 2 articles. I was reading one article today called Spiritual Resistance in Holocaust Literature, right? The topic that we're talking about tonight. And I heard about this thing in Theresienstadt called I heard about a book. I'll show you the book, and then we'll show a short video. The book is called The Theresian Requiem by Joseph Bohr. It's an amazing story about Raphael Schachter, who was the founder of the Prague Chamber Orchestra. The picture on the right is apparently the only picture of this story, where he, in a concentration camp, managed to gather 150 concentration camp inmates and teach them to sing Verdi's Requiem. Now, this was an incredibly difficult task because the people were in slave labor all day, and then they would come back to the camp, and people would get deported, and the numbers would diminish. It turns out that over the course of the few years in Theresian, that they performed this 16 times for concentration camp inmates. The final time they did it was for one of these phony visits by the Red Cross that the Nazis set up in order to try to show that it was a normal life. Theresienstadt, if you've been there, was the sort of model camp that the Nazis took people to show them that, it's not so bad. The vast majority of people, by the way, who went to Theresienstadt were deported to Auschwitz. It was definitely a death camp. It was a concentration camp where people were concentrated for the sake of murdering them in Auschwitz. This is an incredible example of spiritual resistance. The people who were involved in this, and many of them survived. In the interviews that they provided, say that this was our way to show that we still were human, that there was still art, that we could still feel. it was also certainly a escape from the horrors that they were living. But you'll hear in this video the word resistance. This was an act of resistance that these inmates were doing. So I want to show the video. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it and see it. I'm going to start it now. Make it full screen. Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that. I want to make sure. I lost you all. Okay, were you able to hear that when it went on the first time? No, you weren't? Okay, hold on 1 second. Let me try. Can you hear it?
I went downstairs and there was a man sitting and he just said, I want to know, do all of you like to sing?
If people are robbed of freedom, they want to be creative, and they were.
Where this music is powerful, it represents a threat. And it was a tremendous challenge to have the Germans right there in front of us and tell them to their face.
It was something which made us strong. It has given us a resistance against our fate.
Doing a performance was not entertainment. It was a fight for life.
This world is Requiem. Put all of us into another world. This was not the world with the Nazis. This was our world.
These were hours of pure joy, as much as you can call joy in camp.
Here they were, surrounded by man's worst, and these Jewish prisoners were determined to remind everyone of man's best. And I brought the Verdi here because I want to assure these people that we've heard them.
So this is a trailer to a movie called The Defiant Requiem, but it gives you the story of, can you hear me? It gives you the story of what happened, that this Raphael Schechter collected 150 concentration camp inmates in order to create this piece of music. And you heard that it was an act of resistance against their fate. This is another example of spiritual resistance where people refused to allow the Nazis to take away their humanity, their love of the arts, even though they were living in the most inhumane, impossible conditions. When I was in Theresen, I was shown the hidden shul also there. I should have put that picture in this slideshow, but there's a famous hidden shul in Theresen that operated for years and years, which is related to religious resistance. And this is the last piece spiritual resistance. I've taught some of this before. This is an interesting example of spiritual resistance in the sense that in a situation where you would expect all types of concerns for religious life to just be discontinued, we know that almost every rule of the Torah is broken in order to save life. So we would think, why would Jews ask questions of Jewish law during the Shoah? Whatever they had to do to survive, they had to do to survive. And even in questions which were not life and death, why would they care? As we saw in the letters, many of them knew they weren't going to survive. In many of the books written about religious resistance, there's the notion that the Jews continued to ask religious questions as an act of resistance, to show that despite the fact that the Nazis have taken away our freedom, they have taken away all our belongings, and they are killing us, we are still Jews, and we are faithful Jews, and we're not going to let them take that away from us as well. And we're going to maintain our commitment to our traditions. This is not to judge those who didn't. This is to simply explain some of the reasoning behind those who did. And this example of a question that was asked to Rabbi Ephraim Oshry, who was the rabbi of the Kovna ghetto. And you see a picture here of him after the Shoah performing a memorial at Fort 9. The Kovna ghetto was surrounded by a number of forts, and the Jews were often taken out of the Kovna ghetto to these forts where they were murdered. The 9th fort is the most well-known of them. This is the 9th fort, where there was a mass murder, and some people, you see, escaped in 1943. So the little boy, this is unbelievable. This question was posed to Rabbi Oshry. In the ghetto hell, the boy is asked this question. First, Rabbi Oshry, in an act of spiritual resistance, got together a little group of boys on the bottom here, called Tiferes Bachurim, who I taught Torah and the fear of God, and planting in them the seeds for eternal living that would sprout from doing God's will wholeheartedly. Among the boys, he says, was an extraordinary boy from Kovno named Shereshevsky, who, sorry, I'm just getting, oops, sorry about that, who dedicated himself totally to the study of Torah. Even though he was not yet bar mitzvah, he was as precise as an adult in his fulfillment of the mitzvot. And so now, this boy, this is amazing. This boy realizes he's not going to live to his bar mitzvah. And so he asks the following. Now, the edicts of the German taskmasters were issued against every day, especially upon Jewish children. Who could assure this boy that he would even reach the age of 13 to fulfill the mitzvah? This is why he could not wait to don tefillin. So he asked the rabbi if he could put tefillin on before his bar mitzvah. Wanted to in some way fulfill the mitzvah, because he didn't think he's going to be able to fulfill the mitzvah. So, coming from a little boy, this type of spiritual resistance is so heart-wrenching, but also goes to the power of what it was to defy. When I fathomed the simple sincerity of this boy's request, tears gushed from my eyes. I could not help citing the words of the prophet Yirmiyahu. Who would grant that my head be water, my eyes a source of tears, that I could day and night bewail the dead of my nation? For death has come up in our windows, has entered our houses to destroy the youth outside, our chosen ones from the streets. The answer is not important here. He grants him permission, of course. In any case, it's customary to wear tefillin early on before one's bar mitzvah in order to get some practice before it counts. But the question to me was much more powerful. That there would be a boy who would want to ask that question, not to allow the Nazis to steal from him the ability to fulfill the mitzvah of wearing tefillin. So these are a couple of examples of spiritual resistance. We saw the resistance through the camera. We saw the resistance through letters. We saw the resistance through the arts, and we saw the resistance through maintaining religious practices. And that's an important aspect of the Shoah, which we don't often focus on. We focus a lot on the physical resistance and the partisans and the attempts to undermine the Nazi killing machine. And that is, of course, worthy and very, very important. This offers us another type of resistance. It didn't slow down the Nazis necessarily, but it did stop them from erasing the memory of the Jewish people through the pictures and the letters that survived. And it did contribute to people being able to overcome some of the worst living conditions, if you can call it that, in the camps by music and poetry and other types of art. And these are things that speak to the greatness of the human spirit. In this article that I was reading from Yad Vashem Studies, I came across a quote from Camus, which is meaningful in two ways, because it comes from his book, The Plague, and we are living through that in some way ourselves. But he notes something interesting. He writes, "What we learn in times of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise." And so doing the research for this presentation on spiritual resistance certainly reminded me that during that terrible period of our history, there were things to admire. All of these people risked their lives to defy the Nazis and to defy their attempt to erase our memory. And we owe a great deal to them for what they did. And we should remember them for that. With that is the end of the presentation. I'm going to unmute again to see if anyone has any pictures or testimony they want to share, and then we'll say Laila Tov. Okay, so everyone is unmuted. Or I'm going to try again. Okay, would anyone like to say anything?
I would. Andrea.
Who? Oh, please, Andrea. How are you, Andrea?
Hi. In some of my readings about during the periods of the Holocaust, one of the things that always moved me, and I don't know why that particular thing did, but it was the effort of many women to say a bracha over the light bulbs that they had available in the camps. And I thought there was something about it. I guess it was the spirituality that continued even in the midst of the dire circumstances. They've always managed to find a way to say a bracha. And I guess that always meant something to me.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's maybe the simple act of lighting Shabbos candles. We're supposed to be welcoming in sort of a heavenly existence that nonetheless, even though their circumstances did not change, by lighting the Shabbos candles, they were perhaps able to, lighten their spirits a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I see you guys, Shim and Judy. I'm just going to see if anyone else, since you guys had a turn already. Would anyone else like to share anything before I go to Shim and Judy? Albert and Carol, I see you're still muted. I'm trying to unmute you, but I can't.
Albert must be Carol.
There you go.
No, he's not.
And you guys want to share anything? If not, we'll go back to Shim and Judy. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Shim.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the record keeping that the Germans had. We have copies of the transport list of Judy's relatives. We've got death certificates. And
which camps?
Some of them were in Theresienstadt, some were in Birkenau.
And the two first ones were in Auschwitz.
It's Birkenau.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Does anyone know how late into the Shoah the Germans gave death certificates? That seems out of the ordinary.
This was dated 1942, September 1942.
Who issued it? Who issued it? One second. Who issued it?
The doctor. It was probably one of the Jewish doctors in the Teresians had.
I see. So not the Nazis per se.
No, I mean,
Right. Interesting.
they were doing the Nazi bidding.
Right. Amazing that you have those. Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
It depends upon where, as much as anything else. And once the final solution was absolutely implemented in 1942, particularly in the camps, no death certificates, but the records were very accurate. Of course, you don't have records of like Baba Yar or Lithuania.
Right. Right.
We know, but we don't know.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate that you joined. I hope you found it a meaningful way to commemorate Yom HaShoah. Thank you to all who shared their personal stories and pictures and thoughts. It always makes it more meaningful to share things personally. And please God, we should meet again in good health in person, but if not in person, at least in good health.
Please
For those of you interested, tomorrow at noon is Lunch and Learn, but it's bring your own lunch and sit in your own house. We'll be on the same channel at 12 o'clock. Actually, a fascinating topic related to our situation about how God talks to us during trauma, during traumatic situations. So hope to see you then. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.